Hello. In this lecture, we will explore the history of fundraising. When did it begin? Who are the notable people and organisations? And in what ways has it changed and stayed the same over time? We know it's worth studying the history of any subject so that we can learn from the past, but it's more difficult to do for fundraising. Unlike philanthropy, which has attracted the attention of historians, the history of fundraising has largely been overlooked and not deemed worthy of serious study. Here is what we'll cover in this lecture. We'll begin by asking why the history of fundraising has been overlooked, when did fundraising begin, and some evidence for what fundraising has achieved in the past, which enables us to challenge the accepted origin myth of fundraising. We will then explore the social conditions in which fundraising thrived, consider the extent of continuity and change over time, and conclude with a review of the key points in this lecture. We know that asking and giving, the supply and demand of philanthropy, are intimately connected. Both have existed in every part of the world and in every era. And yet, those doing the asking leave far fewer traces than those doing the giving. The actions of philanthropists are recorded in the history books, as well as on buildings, benches, plaques and pillars, as the images on this slide illustrate. Here we see a blue plaque for George Peabody, the American-born philanthropist whose trust still houses 50,000 people across London. Here's one of many statues of Andrew Carnegie, the Scots-born philanthropist, who also left his name on thousands of buildings, including libraries, music halls and universities. Here's me standing in front of a building named after James Colley Ferguson on our Canterbury campus at the University of Kent. Here's a pile of biographies of more and less famous philanthropists, and a picture of Bill Gates receiving an honorary knighthood from the Queen. These are all typical ways in which donors are recognised, and even people giving much smaller sums can hope to see their name on a park bench or thanked in small font in a charity publication. Yet there is no equivalent for the fundraisers. No one recalls who asked Andrew Carnegie or Bill Gates to make their first donation, or who encouraged Peabody to provide social housing, or gave James Colley Ferguson the confidence to pay for a new music building on our campus. Yet as we saw in the last lecture, good things rarely happen without a concerted and organised effort to raise the funds to pay for them. As Wagner says, someone needs to bring in the money, and that someone is a fundraiser. But we are highly unlikely to know anything more about them. Who is it that raises the money to pay for scientific research, to rescue lives at sea, to care for the dying, and to pay for helplines for those in need? And the same goes for the past. To take the anti-slavery movement as an example, we know about the leaders. There are statues to people like William Wilberforce pictured here. But like any campaign, money was needed to pay for the speaking tours, the pamphlets, and the cost of getting the message across. Yet the fundraisers who contributed to the abolition of slavery remain unknown. Likewise, those who organised the fundraising for voluntary schools and hospitals in the era before the welfare state. Some donors still have their names attached to the buildings they paid for, like Thomas Guy's funding of his eponymous hospital. And in the entrance hall to that hospital, the names of many other donors, past and present, are still listed. But the contribution of fundraisers goes unmarked. But this collective amnesia is at least even-handed, as it also overlooks fundraising's more problematic contributions, perhaps most notably the infamous sale of indulgences during the Middle Ages. Men like Johann Tetzel, pictured here, were licensed to sell papal pardons and indulgences to raise funds for religious foundations. Martin Luther, also pictured, a key figure in the Protestant Reformation, was professor of scripture in Wittenberg when he encountered Tetzel in his trade. Luther was outraged that sins could be forgiven for a price, and he attacked this corrupt practice in a document known as the 95 Theses, which, legend has it, he nailed to the door of the Wittenberg church. This document, attacking the raising of funds by selling indulgences, became a key factor in the Protestant Reformation, and the ensuing schism that split the Christian church in the early 16th century. Whilst Johann Tetzel's name is not widely known, for some years the American Philanthropy Monthly magazine awarded an annual Tetzel Award for the most discreditable fundraising performance each year. Tetzel was known as a pardoner, not a fundraiser. Another famous, though fictional, pardoner was one of the 24 storytellers in Geoffrey Chaucer's 14th century The Canterbury Tales. So the history of fundraising is complicated by the fact that the word fundraiser did not become the common term for people undertaking this activity until many centuries later. The word was eventually popularised in a book published in 1957 called The Hidden Persuaders. The title and the cover text show that this was not an entirely flattering account of the activity. But changes in terminology should not obscure the fact that people have long been asking other people to help strangers. Asking is as old as giving, and philanthropy and fundraising are both found in the earliest recorded history. The oldest documented evidence of charitable giving to help the poor comes in the Egyptian Book of the Dead, dating back up to 4th century BCE, which praises those who gave bread to the hungry and water to the thirsty. Whilst there's no explicit reference to asking, the scribes who wrote it helped to establish norms around benevolence and offered the ultimate donor benefit of admittance to the afterlife. Other peoples of the ancient Mediterranean world helped to shape the definition and practice of philanthropy. The Greek origins of the word philanthropy, philo meaning loving and anthropos meaning mankind, and its first use in the 5th century BCE Greek myth Prometheus Bound, in which the title character steals fire from the gods as a gift for humankind in need of light and warmth, underlines the centrality of the concept in ancient Greece, where subjects even addressed the emperors of Byzantium as your philanthropy. Emulating the peoples they had conquered, philanthropy was also an essential part of life in ancient Rome, where rich citizens paid for civic institutions including libraries, theatres, stadia, and schools for poor children. Donations for the school endowments encouraged by Pliny were said to be carefully sourced, and we know about a rich man of Gythion who funded oils for the public baths in AD 161-9, who was given prominent recognition of his gift on marble pillars. Typically, we know the name of the donors, but nothing about the person who negotiated the terms of the gift and the inscription. So the organised transfer of resources from private individuals to the public good was clearly evident long before it became codified as essential within the Judeo-Christian tradition and later in Islam. Indeed, every major religion encourages its followers to be charitable. Tzedakah is a central concept in the Jewish tradition. The literal translation from the Hebrew is justice or righteousness, but it's commonly understood as an encouragement of charitable giving. And fundraising is also encouraged in the Jewish faith. It is a greater virtue to cause another to give than to give yourself, wrote Rabbi Akiba. Rules on tithing for Jews and Christians were first described in the Old Testament book of Genesis, and zakat, one of the 5 pillars of Islam, also specifies what percentage of income and savings should be set aside for almsgiving. Nonetheless, it's clear from passages in various religious texts that it remained necessary to encourage the charitable impulse and to designate individuals to oversee charitable giving. People within the Jewish and Christian communities were appointed to organise the collection and distribution of charity, and it is possible that some of them were paid to undertake this task. The first mention of fundraising in the Bible's Old Testament appears in Exodus chapter 30, when the Israelites are told to make a contribution to pay for the tent where religious services take place. As this was essentially paying for a facility that the donors themselves would use, the first mention of fundraising for the benefit of others appears in the New Testament in Acts chapter 6, when the disciples appoint 7 men of good reputation filled with spirit and with wisdom to gather and distribute food for needy widows. The wording in this passage highlights the enduring importance of the personal characteristics of those tasked with organising generosity. Some of the techniques used by these earliest fundraisers would be familiar today. Mullin describes St. Paul's letters to the Corinthians as a remarkable precedent for modern fundraising letters, and offers this illuminating paraphrased version of one such letter, in which Paul urges the Corinthians, "There is famine in Palestine, give your support. I am sending Titus to receive the money you promised and have told people how generous you will be. Every week before he arrives, set aside a considered sum calculated according to your means. If you are not as generous as promised to be, I and you will be shamed. There were previous complaints about the handling of funds, so please appoint trustees to account for the money." These words make clear that fundraising was an accepted and understood practice, as no explanation was necessary to clarify or justify the making of this request. Furthermore, it's clear that fundraising was organised, both at the individual level of calculating a reasonable size of donation, and at the community level with the appointment of trusted individuals to collect and account for the funds raised. So whilst the terms fundraiser and fundraising were not used in the ancient world, it's clear that the act of raising resources to help others was a perfectly familiar feature in antiquity. Leaping forward to the medieval period, the fruits of fundraising efforts are most obviously seen in the enormous and enormously expensive cathedrals that were built across northern Europe during the Middle Ages. They required capital appeals for their construction, as well as ongoing income for running costs. As Leon Mullin writes, the detailed fundraising strategies that ushered in the completion of the cathedrals of Northern Europe required concerted investment in sophisticated prospect research techniques. Mullin offers another helpfully paraphrased letter to demonstrate the long-standing existence of fundraising appeals, this time from Bishop Stephen after the destruction in 1174 of the monastery of St. Aversius near Orleans in France. Standing in the smoking ashes of our church among the scorched timbers of its walls, soon to rise again, we are forced to approach the general public and shamelessly to ask for support from outside gifts. Cathedral fundraising in Europe in the Middle Ages used a wide range of methods, including collection boxes, match funding between bishops and chapters, high society fundraising, major patrons, and even sponsored events, such as a sponsored bell ringing at Rouen, described by Mullin. A set of model fundraising letters was produced by 14th century Cistercian monks in Austria, in which they advised those asking for support by mail to include a honeyed salutation, a tactful exordium, an oration, a petition, and a graceful peroration. The fundraising instincts of many members of religious orders and of their advisors is often evident. To give three further examples, in 1157, the advisor to the Archbishop of Canterbury, John of Salisbury, wrote to his friend Peter in France, recommending that the relics of saints and letters authenticating them be used to stimulate support for a fundraising appeal to rebuild a church that had recently been destroyed by fire. In the 16th century, the founder of the Jesuits, Ignatius Loyola, set out in the Constitution of the Society of Jesus how donors should be acknowledged and thanked in annual rituals such as the blessing and lighting of the founder's candle. And in 1655, the first fundraising dinner organised by the Sons of the Clergy was held in London, an annual event that continues today. Turning now to our next example, universities. Fundraising has been a part of higher education from the start. The UK's oldest universities, such as Oxford, Cambridge and St Andrews, all needed to raise funds to be built in the first place and have continued to seek private support for their upkeep and expansion. British donors were also encouraged to support the building of universities in the then colonies. In 1641, three clergymen, Hugh Peter, Thomas Weld and William Hibbons, sailed from Boston in the US to London to raise funds for the fledgling Harvard College. The clergymen wrote back from London, requesting a document to support their fundraising efforts, what nowadays we would call a case for support. The result was a pamphlet called New England's First Fruits, published in 1643, which was 47 pages of densely argued text setting out the need for funding and culminating in the ask, "Lend us, we beseech you, your prayers and help in heaven and earth for the furtherance of this great and glorious work." The pamphlet ends with model answers to be used when responding to common objections of donors who might need convincing that New England was a suitable place to send support. Potential objections include, "Your ground is barren, your winters are cold, and many speak evil of the place." This attention to detail in anticipating problems and preparing responses is a clear illustration that pre-20th century philanthropy was not, as some suggest, entirely spontaneous and lacking in organisation. Our final historical example is the voluntary hospitals, which were the prime providers of free healthcare for the UK population until the tax-funded National Health Service was established in 1948. Originally, hospitals were attached to monasteries and convents, but after their dissolution in 1540, they needed secular support to survive. Like cathedrals, a major capital appeal was required to buy the land, to build and equip a new hospital, followed by continuous fundraising efforts to pay for medical staff salaries and annual running costs, as well as for repairs and modernisation. This meant that hospital administrators were constantly worried about fundraising, and that hospital fundraising was a significant element of charitable activity in the UK, especially during the 19th century. Every available fundraising method was used, including charity dinners, gala events, street collections and public collections. The Hospital Sunday Fund began in 1873 to receive the proceeds of one church collection per year, and the Hospital Saturday Fund launched the following year when workers who were paid on Saturdays pledged a donation from their wage. Royal patronage played a key role in hospital fundraising, with kings and queens throughout the age prioritising this cause. In 1912, the Queen Consort launched the Alexandra Rose Days. Silk roses were sold on the streets, as shown in this picture, and raised the equivalent of £2 million for London hospitals on its first day. The insufficiency of voluntary funding to meet the health needs of a nation became increasingly clear and eventually resulted in the creation of the NHS in 1948. But this did not mark the end of fundraising for hospitals, three of which, Christie's, Great Ormond Street and Guy's, continued to raise more than 10% of their total income from donations, and hospitals and healthcare continue to be one of the most popular cause areas supported by donors and philanthropists in the UK. Yet despite this extensive evidence of successful asking across the centuries, Many people maintain that fundraising began in the late 19th, early 20th century. The current accepted explanation, the origin myth if you like, for the invention of fundraising, cites three American fundraisers, Charles Sumner Ward, Lyman Pierce, and Jonathan Pryce Jones. In 1890, Ward was appointed General Secretary of the Young Men's Christian Association in Grand Rapids, USA. He soon displayed a talent for raising large sums through short-term, intensive fundraising drives. Together with a colleague, Lyman Pierce, he was sent to help other YMCAs around the country, using the so-called whirlwind campaign or Ward-Pierce approach, which involved three main ingredients. Firstly, a highly organised backroom operation undertaken by paid consultants who recruited local, well-connected volunteers to front the campaign. The backroom operation involved securing pledges for around a third of the intended goal, so that the campaign was already a success before the public phase was launched. For example, the 1902 campaign for a new Y in Washington, D.C. was launched with a banquet at which it was announced that John D. Rockefeller had already subscribed $50,000. Secondly, they used cutting-edge public relations techniques to launch the public phase of the campaign, seeking maximum publicity in local media to emphasise the urgency of reaching the goal. And thirdly, the public phase had a concentrated time span of around a fortnight, chosen to secure the support of busy local business leaders and to keep the campaign in the headlines. In 1912, Ward was invited to the UK to run a successful campaign for the Manchester YMCA. Back in the US, Ward and Pierce were then loaned to the Red Cross for the duration of World War I to deploy their techniques to raise funds to support soldiers on the front line and those returning with injuries, as well as the families of those killed in action and civilians affected by bomb damage. They raised unprecedentedly large sums, including $114 million, equivalent to over £2 billion in today's money, in just 8 days in 1917. When the First World War ended in 1918, the mass campaign had become an established fundraising method, and for those with the skills of organising such campaigns, fundraising had become established as a paid job. Soon after the war ended, a number of profitable fundraising businesses were created in the US, primarily led by key figures from the YMCA School of Fundraisers, notably the firm of Ward, Hill, Pierce and Wells, established in 1919 and including two of the key names from the successful Y and Red Cross campaigns. A younger man, Jonathan Pryce Jones, is often cited as the third founding member of the fundraising profession. Originally a journalist, his post-war fundraising business enjoyed phenomenal success and found innovative ways to highlight campaigns, such as putting fundraising messages onto milk bottles, utility bills, and bank statements. The ideas and techniques of Ward, Pierce, and Jones were codified in the first manual on fundraising, written by Harold Seymour in 1966. But their influence was not confined to introducing new techniques and to accomplishing ever higher campaign goals. It also included their emphasis on fundraising as a values-based enterprise rather than purely a commercial venture, summed up most pithily in Ward's assertion, "I would leave this work immediately if I thought I were merely raising money. It is raising men that appeals to me." However, as others have noted, positioning for-profit fundraising consultancy as an overtly ethical enterprise could be interpreted as an astute marketing move when trying to win business from charitable organisations. The contribution of Ward, Pierce and Jones is undoubtedly impressive, and it is reasonable to describe them as the creators of the for-profit fundraising consultancy industry, but it is clearly inaccurate to claim that they founded fundraising per se, or that systematically asking strangers for donations began in the US at the beginning of the 20th century. Yet fundraising's origin myth continues to be repeated, and is persuasive because it relies on a great man interpretation of history, which has also been replicated in the UK. The great man theory is a 19th century idea, most famously articulated by the Scottish philosopher Thomas Carlyle, who asserted that history is essentially driven by the acts and personalities of rare and heroic great men. Modern social science foregrounds the role of prevailing social conditions, which are understood to shape and constrain the autonomous action of individuals. But a great man view of history persists in the popular imagination, and is clearly evident in the accepted account of the emergence of fundraising just described. So the history of fundraising such as it exists has tended to focus on a handful of key personalities who are said to have shaped the profession, and the UK has its own equivalent of Ward, Pierce and Jones. George Smith describes Leslie Kirkley, Harold Sumption and Guy Stringer as the founding fathers of modern British fundraising. Kirkley helped to form the Oxford Committee for Famine Relief and used his fundraising acumen to grow the organisation until it became one of the UK's biggest and best-known charities, Oxfam. Harold Sumption also worked at Oxfam, as well as a number of other leading charities. He established the viability of what are now mainstream fundraising techniques, such as direct mail, off-the-page press advertising, trading catalogues and cinema commercials. His successes involved reinvention as much as invention. He saw the untapped potential in old-fashioned practices, such as the humble collecting box. According to Smith, he had volunteers deliver 6 million collection boxes, an exercise that added 400,000 new donors to Oxfam's first computerised database. Guy Stringer is the younger of the three UK men. He served in World War II and Korea before becoming commercial director of Oxfam in 1969, where he introduced the selling of crafts made by people in the developing world, what is now called fair trade. He became director of Oxfam in 1982, but still spent Friday afternoons on the phone, personally thanking all donors who gave £500 or more. By the time he retired, the charity's income had increased from £2.5 million in 1969 to £51 million in 1986. All six men, Ward, Pearson Jones, Kirkley, Sumption and Stringer, clearly deserve credit for their innovative and successful efforts in the consultancy business for the US triad and within major charities, especially Oxfam for the three UK men. But to describe them as the inventors of fundraising raises at least two awkward and unanswerable questions. How can this account be squared with the existence of systematic, organised fundraising before the 20th century? And how did fundraising develop in any country other than the US and the UK? Is there a male triumvirate waiting to be named in every region that now has a thriving fundraising industry? There is a further complicating factor in understanding the emergence of fundraising. Philanthropy is alleged to have enjoyed golden ages in the 18th and 19th centuries, yet it is also suggested that fundraising only really began in the early 20th century. Given the known symbiotic relationship between asking and giving, such that most donations occur after a specific request for help, this unlikely sequence is undermined still further by historical evidence from the 19th century that the collective contributions of the poor, who were prompted to give pounds, shillings and pence by door-to-door collectors and via the church collection plate, came to many millions each year, according to Prochaska. As there is no reason to assume that poorer donors needed prompting, whilst richer donors gave proactively without prompting, we appear to be overlooking the existence of fundraising during the golden ages of philanthropy, and indeed in earlier periods. So it is clear that effective asking of rich and poor has occurred for centuries, and the results of some of that fundraising is still evident in the form of cathedrals, universities and hospital buildings, as well as schools, libraries, galleries, museums and so on, and also less tangibly, but no less importantly, in the social changes that needed philanthropic funding to be achieved, from the abolition of slavery to more recent equalities and environmental legislation. But this continuity coexists with change. The development of fundraising has been tightly linked to the development of communication technologies and the possibilities that they present for reaching potential donors. The pulpit was an effective site for fundraising for centuries. Then the invention of the printing press brought opportunities for mass communication, as did the development of the postal service, telephones, television, and most recently personal computers, mobile technology and social media. So changing communication technologies are a crucial factor in the development of fundraising opportunities and possibilities. And at least three other broad social conditions have facilitated the historic development of fundraising. The new ideas and ways of thinking about improving society that became known as the Age of Enlightenment, the emergence of the public sphere, which created spaces for collective social action to occur, and the rapid spread of wealth across society, which enabled a large part of the population to participate in associational philanthropy. We will look more closely at each of these three factors before concluding this lecture. The Age of Enlightenment is a period in Western thought and culture when revolutions in all parts of society, including science, culture, philosophy and politics, replaced the medieval worldview and transformed Western civilization. A key feature of this period, which peaked in the 18th century, was a renewed respect for the power of reason in all aspects of life, in contrast to the largely unquestioned authority of the Church in the Middle Ages. Applying reason to thinking about the often difficult conditions in which fellow human beings lived led to a change in sensibilities such that people became less tolerant of suffering and more willing to try to help relieve that suffering. Giving and asking became more likely as a result of an Enlightenment confidence that given the appropriate environment, people's lives could be reshaped. And the surge of philanthropic activity in this period has been noted by numerous social historians. The idea of the public sphere draws on the work of Jürgen Habermas, whose seminal book, published in 1962, describes the 18th century emergence of new public spaces in which people could act and live their lives, rather than existing primarily in private domesticity. The public sphere involves both physical spaces, such as coffee houses and salons, as well as conceptual spaces, such as in newspapers, where people are able to exchange ideas and collaborate as private citizens, out with, and sometimes in opposition to, the state. The civic society that flourished in these conditions led to the establishment of many self-governing charitable organisations. People of moderate and minimal wealth could not fund these organisations without seeking others to share the costs involved. This led to the birth of collective or associational philanthropy, whereby like-minded people collaborate to fund a shared goal, such as building a new hospital, or to collectively pursue an abstract goal, such as a vision of a better society in which slavery is abolished, manners are improved, or people abstain from alcohol. Fundraising therefore became a necessary element of the emergence of the public sphere. As Roger Davis explains, here lie the origins of the model that forms the bedrock of modern charitable giving, that of addressing a social issue by supporting dedicated cause-driven organisations via donations. Philanthropists were no longer required to solve society's problems themselves, but instead could support a range of organisations already working to address these problems. The emergence of a booming civic society that enabled people to collaborate in order to question and attempt to change the existing order occurred in the same century as the start of the First Industrial Revolution. The transition from a country in which most people survived by working on their own land or in their own homes to one in which many survived by working for other people, often in factories, led to many diverse positive and negative consequences. One was the emergence of what Barry and Brooks call the middling orders, who were neither very rich nor very poor. Overall, as this graph shows, between 1850 and 1900, the wages of the population doubled in real terms, which means accounting for inflation. As more and more people were able to make voluntary financial donations, a larger and more organised body of fundraisers was needed to liaise with this ever-widening constituency of potential donors, as Zunz notes, though in his case with reference to the US. So dramatic changes in society, especially around the 18th and 19th centuries, clearly affected the development of fundraising and philanthropy in the UK. We finished by briefly mentioning some other examples of change over time, always bearing in mind that these changes coexist with continuity, because since the start of recorded history, people have been asking other people to help strangers. Contemporary fundraising has a number of distinctive features. It is largely secularised and involves intense competition amongst an ever-growing number of charities, appealing to a larger part of the population, the mass affluent, reached by largely impersonal communications, albeit segmented and tailored to some extent. There has been growth in the fundraising profession, which has shifted from male to female dominance, with slowly growing diversity in other respects. There has been a codification of fundraising knowledge in books and training courses, and there are now national membership bodies to support and represent fundraisers, established in 1935 in the US and in 1983 in the UK. The final shift is from sporadic to ongoing fundraising efforts. In the early 20th century, even some of the largest charitable organisations only launched a campaign once or twice a decade, with fallow periods when charities were not focused on fundraising. But by mid-20th century, fundraising had become a continuous effort within many charities, requiring more in-house fundraisers as there was work to occupy them year-round. We conclude this lecture by recapping some of the key points. We began by noting that, despite the parallel practices of asking and giving, the history of philanthropy is dominated by the donors and not the askers. Philanthropists have consistently taken centre stage in accounts of charitable transactions, meaning that fundraising has been overlooked and problematised throughout history. There is minimal historical evidence of asking, so the nature and degree of organisation by pre-20th century fundraisers is largely unknowable, but the end result of their efforts is evident for all to see. Enormous cathedrals, significant secular buildings, and impactful charitable organisations, which do not spring up or get funded spontaneously. Fundraising, like everything, is a product of its time. It develops to reflect changing social norms, technological opportunities, and economic and political realities. The 18th and 19th centuries saw especially rapid developments in all these spheres. Finally, although the practice and broad principles of solicitation have remained relatively unchanged over the centuries, there have been significant changes in the way these principles have been implemented in practice as a result of new communication technologies, wider changes in society, and within the fundraising profession. On this slide and the next, you will find all the references from this lecture.